If you stay until the end of this video, you will not just understand global economics more clearly. You will understand why power, trust, and money are now separating from each other, and why nations that once felt safe are quietly preparing for a different world. What looks like trade policy on the surface is, in reality, a signal about who can still be relied on when pressure rises. This story is not about politics alone. It is about reliability and what happens when reliability becomes negotiable. For decades, the United States was treated as the anchor of the global economic system. Its currency, its markets, and its alliances formed the backbone of international stability. When uncertainty appeared, capital flowed toward America, not away from it. The assumption was simple. The U.S. might argue, but it would remain predictable. That assumption is now being questioned, not by rivals, but by longtime partners. In the second Trump presidency, something subtle but powerful has shifted. Economic relationships are no longer framed primarily as partnerships. They are increasingly treated as leverage. Tariffs, energy exports, and access to U.S. markets are being used not just as tools of policy, but as instruments of pressure. The message being received abroad is not always spoken directly, but it is clearly understood. Cooperation is conditional. Stability is transactional. This change is not theoretical. It is measurable. In 2025, the average U.S. tariff rate on imports rose from roughly 2.5% to over 22%, according to Fitch Ratings and international trade data. That level had not been seen since the early 20th century. This was not a minor adjustment. It represented a structural shock to how global companies plan, invest, and manage risk. For European companies, the signal was immediate. German investment into the United States fell by approximately 45% in 2025 compared to the year before. That is not a political statement. That is capital reacting to uncertainty. German exports to the U.S. also dropped by nearly 9% in the same period. Automotive, machinery, and chemical sectors were among the hardest hit. These are not small industries. They are the backbone of Europe's industrial economy. At the same time, U.S. trade actions began to affect allies in ways that felt less like negotiation and more like coercion. Tariffs were threatened, imposed, or expanded across Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Steel and aluminum tariffs of 25% were reinstated. Broad tariffs of 20% or more were applied to major partners. Retaliation followed. Counter-tariffs followed. What was once a rules-based system began to resemble a pressure-based system. But trade is only one layer of this story. Energy has become another. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe rapidly reduced its dependence on Russian gas. By 2025, Russian pipeline gas dropped from around 60% of European supply to under 10%. That gap was filled primarily by U.S. liquefied natural gas. By the end of 2025, the United States supplied nearly 60% of all LNG imports into the European Union, and over 2/3 of LNG imports into the United Kingdom. On paper, this looked like security. In reality, it created a new dependency. European policy institutes began warning that energy had become a strategic vulnerability. When energy flows depend on a partner whose trade and foreign policy is increasingly transactional, reliability becomes a variable, not a constant. The concern is not only price. The concern is leverage. This is why the phrase "less reliable" is now being used quietly in policy circles. Not as an accusation, as a risk assessment. Reliability in global economics is not about friendship. It is about predictability. When rules change quickly, when tariffs appear without long lead time, when agreements are reopened under pressure, long-term planning becomes fragile. Capital does not like fragility. Supply chains do not like fragility. Governments do not like fragility. This is why the European Union has accelerated trade agreements with regions outside the United States. Agreements with South America, with parts of Asia, and with emerging markets are moving faster. The goal is diversification, not because the U.S. is weak, but because the U.S. is now less predictable. At the same time, U.S. trade conflict with China has intensified. Tariffs on Chinese imports have reached levels above 100% in some categories. China has retaliated with tariffs and export controls, including restrictions on rare earth materials. Bilateral trade volumes have sharply declined. U.S. GDP contracted slightly in early 2025. Chinese exports to the U.S. have also fallen. The damage is mutual. The uncertainty is global. What makes this moment different is not the presence of conflict. Conflict has always existed in trade. What is different is how openly economic tools are being used as strategic weapons, even against allies. Canada, one of America's closest trading partners, has faced tariffs and public pressure. Public opinion polls in both countries now show declining trust. The relationship is still large, but the tone has changed. From a Machiavellian perspective, this is rational. Power is being centralized. Leverage is being emphasized. Short-term advantage is being prioritized over long-term trust. From a market perspective, however, this creates a different reaction. Markets price risk. Trust reduces risk. When trust weakens, risk premiums rise. Investment slows. Alternatives are explored. This is why German firms, European policymakers, and Asian exporters are not waiting for clarity. They are adapting in advance. They are diversifying trade routes. They are building redundancy. They are preparing for a world in which the U.S. is still powerful, but no longer the single stable anchor it once was. The paradox is that this strategy may strengthen American leverage in the short term, while weakening American centrality in the long term. Power based on pressure can extract concessions. Power based on trust attracts alignment. These are two different economic models. One creates dependency, the other creates loyalty. Right now, many countries are quietly recalculating, not because they want to leave the U.S. system, but because they no longer assume it will always function the same way tomorrow as it does today. That assumption, once taken for granted, is now gone. This is not the collapse of American power. It is the transformation of how that power is perceived. And perception, in economics, often becomes reality before policy does. The real story is not in the headlines. It is in the structural decisions being made quietly, inside ministries of finance, inside corporate boardrooms, and inside long-term investment models. When trust weakens, actors do not protest loudly. They redesign systems silently. That is what is happening now. For Europe, this moment is forcing a strategic re-evaluation that goes far beyond tariffs. For decades, European integration was built on the assumption that the United States would remain the final backstop. Not just militarily, but economically. When crises hit, dollar liquidity would be available. When trade disputes arose, they would be contained within a rules-based framework. That framework is no longer taken as guaranteed. The European Central Bank and multiple EU policy bodies have openly discussed the need to strengthen the Euro-ES role in global trade and finance. This is not symbolism, it is defensive architecture. The more trade and energy contracts are denominated in euros instead of dollars, the less exposed Europe becomes to U.S. political volatility. This is not anti-American, it is risk management. At the same time, European companies are shortening supply chains and relocating production closer to home. Nearshoring and friendshoring are no longer buzzwords. They are operational strategies. Manufacturing that once relied on predictable transatlantic flows is being redesigned to reduce exposure to sudden tariff shocks. This costs more in the short term. It is chosen anyway, because uncertainty costs more in the long term. Energy makes this calculation even sharper. After the collapse of Russian gas flows, U.S. LNG became a lifeline. But lifelines can become levers. When a single supplier controls a dominant share of supply, pricing power increases. Contract terms harden. Strategic vulnerability rises. European energy planners understand this dynamic very well. They have lived through it before. This is why Europe is accelerating renewable investment, LNG diversification, and pipeline alternatives. Not because U.S. gas is unreliable today, but because dependency itself is a strategic liability. In a world where economic policy is increasingly weaponized, dependency equals exposure. Asia is making similar calculations. Japan and South Korea remain close U.S. allies, but both are expanding trade and financial ties with Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. These are not ideological moves, they are hedges. When a system becomes less predictable, rational actors build parallel options. Even Taiwan, deeply connected to the U.S. for security and technology, is diversifying export destinations and supplier relationships. Semiconductor supply chains are being geographically distributed. This is not only about resilience against physical disruption, it is about resilience against political disruption. In financial markets, this shift shows up in subtle ways. Central banks in emerging markets have been slowly increasing the share of non-dollar assets in their reserves. Gold holdings have risen. Bilateral trade settlement in local currencies has expanded between certain regions. None of this replaces the dollar, but it reduces single-point dependence. This is how global systems change. Not through dramatic collapse, through slow erosion of exclusivity. The dollar remains dominant, but dominance is no longer unquestioned. That alone changes behavior. From a corporate perspective, investment committees now assign higher risk premiums to U.S.'s exposed trade flows. That does not mean abandoning the U.S. market. It means demanding higher returns to justify the same exposure. Higher required returns mean fewer projects pass the threshold. This is how uncertainty quietly slows growth. What makes this more complex is that the United States is still one of the most attractive investment destinations in the world. Its market depth, legal infrastructure, and innovation capacity remain unmatched in many areas. The issue is not attractiveness. The issue is volatility of rules. Capital can tolerate high costs. It struggles with unpredictable frameworks. The logic of America First reshapes alliance economics in a fundamental way. Alliances are no longer treated as structural commitments. They are treated as negotiating positions. That changes the psychology of partners. When long-term alignment becomes conditional, partners respond by making their own long-term plans conditional as well. This is not emotional. It is systemic. Trust is an economic asset. When trust declines, transaction costs rise. Contracts become shorter. Hedging becomes more expensive. Insurance becomes more complex. Compliance structures grow heavier. All of this reduces efficiency. From a Machiavellian lens, this may appear acceptable. Short-term leverage is increased. Concessions can be extracted, but leverage decays when alternatives are built. Over time, the very pressure that creates compliance also accelerates diversification. That is the strategic trade-off. There is also a narrative shift occurring. For decades, the United States positioned itself as the architect and guarantor of a rules-based economic order. That narrative created soft power. It attracted alignment even when direct benefits were uneven. As that narrative weakens, alignment becomes more transactional. Transactional systems are inherently less stable. Markets understand this intuitively. They price long-term uncertainty into currencies, bonds, and equity risk premiums. Even small increases in perceived instability can have large cumulative effects over years. This is not a crash dynamic, it is a drift dynamic. What makes this period historically significant is that it is happening while global debt levels are high, demographic pressures are rising, and geopolitical tensions are already elevated. The margin for error is thinner than it was in previous decades. Reliability is more valuable now than it was when growth was faster and buffers were larger. This is why the phrase less reliable carries so much weight. It does not mean unreliable. It means no longer taken for granted. In global economics, that distinction is everything. The world is not moving away from the United States. It is moving away from single-point dependency on the United States. That is a quieter but more profound shift. And once systems are redesigned for diversification, they rarely return to full concentration. Optionality, once built, becomes permanent. In the next part, the question becomes deeper. What does this mean for America's long-term financial centrality? What happens to the dollar's unique position? And what kind of power remains when trust is no longer automatic but conditional? At the center of the global economic system is not a country. It is a currency. For more than 70 years, the U.S. dollar has been the operating system of international finance. Trade is priced in it. Debt is issued in it. Reserves are stored in it. Crises are managed through it. This is not only economic power. It is structural power. The privilege of issuing the world's primary reserve currency gives the United States extraordinary advantages. It lowers borrowing costs. It deepens financial markets. It allows deficits to be financed more easily than any other nation. It also creates demand for U.S. assets, regardless of domestic politics. This is what financial centrality looks like. But financial centrality is built on two pillars: scale and trust. Scale alone is not enough. Markets must believe that rules will remain stable, contracts will be honored, and access will not be politicized unpredictably. When access to trade, finance, or settlement systems becomes a bargaining chip, even subtly, that belief weakens. Over the last decade, and more visibly under renewed Trump-era economic strategy, financial tools have increasingly been treated as instruments of policy. Sanctions, export controls, tariff regimes, and financial restrictions have become normalized. In isolation, each action can be justified. In aggregate, they change how the system is perceived. For countries and institutions that rely on dollar-based systems, this creates a strategic question. What happens if access becomes conditional? What happens if financial infrastructure becomes a negotiating tool? The rational response is not panic. It is preparation. This is why alternative payment systems, regional clearing arrangements, and bilateral currency swap lines have quietly expanded. None of these replace the dollar, but each reduces total exposure. Each adds optionality. Optionality is the enemy of monopoly power. Central bank data reflects this trend. While the dollar still represents roughly 58 to 60% of global foreign exchange reserves, that share has declined from over 70% in the early 2000s. The change is slow, but it is persistent. The euro, gold, and smaller currencies have gained marginal share. Marginal shifts matter over long time horizons. Gold is especially revealing. Central banks purchased record amounts of gold in 2022, 2023, and 2024, continuing into 2025. Gold is not about yield. It is about neutrality. It is an asset with no political jurisdiction. Rising gold reserves signal a desire to reduce reliance on any single financial system. This does not mean a collapse of dollar dominance. It means a gradual dilution of exclusivity. The dollar can remain number one while still losing structural leverage. That is a subtle but critical distinction. From a Machiavellian perspective, using financial centrality as leverage can appear optimal. If you control the system, why not extract maximum advantage? The risk is that every use of leverage teaches others how to live without it. Over time, the very act of using power accelerates the creation of alternatives. This is the paradox of transactional power. It is highly effective early. It is less effective later. It produces compliance in the short run and diversification in the long run. Once diversification exists, pressure yields diminishing returns. There is also a reputational layer that cannot be measured easily. For decades, U.S. leadership in global finance was associated with institutional stability. That reputation reduced friction. It lowered the perceived political risk premium. When reputation shifts, even slightly, capital pricing shifts with it. In practical terms, this can mean higher long-term borrowing costs. It can mean more competition for reserve currency share. It can mean reduced willingness to hold large concentrations of U.S. assets for purely defensive reasons. None of this is dramatic in a single year. Over 10 or 20 years, it compounds. What makes this moment different is that alternatives now exist in ways they did not before. Digital settlement systems, regional development banks, and multipolar trade networks provide partial substitutes. They are not perfect. They do not need to be. They only need to be sufficient to reduce dependency. This is why the long-term cost of transactional strategy is not visible in quarterly data. It appears in architecture, in where pipelines are built, in what currency contracts are written, in where manufacturing capacity is located. These decisions, once made, are hard to reverse. From a strategic standpoint, the United States still has immense advantages. Market size, military power, innovation ecosystems, legal frameworks. None of these disappear. The question is not whether the U.S. remains powerful. The question is what kind of power it chooses to exercise. Power based on attraction builds systems that center on you voluntarily. Power based on pressure builds systems that root around you quietly. Both work. Only one compounds. The phrase "less reliable" is not an insult. It is a signal. It means partners no longer assume continuity. They assume contingency. In economic systems, contingency planning is the first step toward structural change. The deeper message of this period is not about one administration. It is about a model, a shift from being the default anchor to being a dominant negotiator. That shift changes incentives for everyone else. In the end, this is not about America losing influence. It is about America changing the nature of its influence, from central architect to powerful participant, from guarantor to enforcer, from system builder to system negotiator. That is a different kind of leadership. It can be effective. It can also be isolating. The world is adapting, not rebelling. It is hedging, not confronting. It is preparing for a future where reliability is no longer assumed, but priced. And in economics, what gets priced eventually gets redesigned. The real question is not whether the United States will remain strong. The real question is whether strength will be defined by how much pressure can be applied, or by how much trust can be sustained. Because in the long arc of global systems, trust builds empires. Pressure builds resistance. And resistance, once it becomes infrastructure, rarely disappears.